Welcome back to Compact Convos. Today we're going to be discussing artillery, one of my favorite pieces in all of wargaming. Back here with Caleb, and Caleb, what kind of artillery types do we have?
Yeah, so we're mainly going to be hitting the black powder era. So if you're looking at the rifled artillery from the Civil War, we're not really going to be hitting that. We're talking more smooth bore. But during the black powder era, you're going to have two main types. You have indirect artillery and you have direct artillery fire.
So let's go with the obvious ones real quick. Is how do we paint them? How do we base them? Starting with direct fire, then we'll get an indirect.
Yeah, so direct fire artillery, these are your classic straight shot cannons, right? When we're talking indirect, they shoot up in the air, direct fire, straight out the barrel. Um, you can paint these. There's a lot of ways you can paint these. First of all, the cannons you either have like cast iron or brass or bronze, right? So paint those accordingly. Maybe research, what time period, what nation used what type of metals for their cannons. That could help you paint that. Also, the carriages they sit on. I know, for instance, the Prussian army really liked a kind of like a light blue color on the carriages for their cannons to sit on. Whereas the French, I believe, had a more green. So you could look at historical paintings of these armies from the era to give you the idea of how to paint those. And really, that goes for both direct and indirect.
Okay, and then we'll get right into direct artillery. Let's start. We have three types: light, medium, and heavy, at least for our rule sets and black powder era. Let's start with what light artillery is in our rule set and how do we implement that into the campaign, but really, I guess, the battlefield, because cat or artillery doesn't have a huge campaign effect other than knowing where it's at.
Yeah, so I would say the only aspect of artillery in campaign is maybe sieges. Artillery can just play a fact and how long a siege plays out. But the three main types, let's hit light artillery first. So light artillery is designed for mobility and close support. So they can move with advancing infantry and react quickly to changing battlefield conditions. So we're thinking 3 pounder, 4 pounder guns, also term called battalion guns. So a gun that's assigned to a battalion. So very small, light, traveled with the battalion. Um, Tabletop use, these need to have a higher mobility, a lower firepower, and a shorter range. So you're trading firepower and range for mobility. And these are mainly used to keep up with offensive operations. So if you were rapidly assaulting a fortified position, and you want to have very close fire support, your light artillery will do the job. Your heavy artillery, far behind the lines can shoot, but maybe they're not as accurate because they're not as close. So use light artillery aggressively. They should support advancing infantry rather than sitting at the back of the table because they don't have the range. Um, I would also make them, whenever they do hit, make the damage a little less than the artillery types we're about to talk about.
I agree. I remember there's one. I think it was just a set battle that we did. I don't think it was part of a campaign, but I was in control of Lee's Legion. He has, I think, two cannons with him. I had them set up in some woods and got to watch a cavalry charge fail, but my cannons were successful, so that's what I took away from it. And I think in Guilford Courthouse, the battle that
Mm.
we should be having that video come out in July. If I'm not mistaken, your light cav for the or not light cav, I'm sorry, light artillery for the British, they couldn't really do much because they were just a little bit too far behind, and then melee started happening.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Right.
let's go with the one that is the bread and butter. It seems like on both armies, medium artillery.
Yeah. So medium artillery is it's the workhorse of black powder armies. These guns are going to balance firepower and mobility, and they're going to make up a majority of artillery in both armies, as you just said. So you're thinking 6 pounder, 8 pounder, 9 pounder guns. These have a balanced range and damage. They have reasonable mobility, and they're fairly effective against most targets. If you're unsure of what artillery you need in your army, this should be your default. Um, like For instance, our light artillery in our rule set can shoot at 25 inches, medium artillery can shoot at 40 inches. And whereas the light artillery, you have to roll between a 5 and a 6 to hit, depending on the range. Medium artillery is a 4 to 6 to hit. So it's a really good in between of everything. It doesn't have like the most damaging firepower like heavy artillery, but it also doesn't have the range incapacitation like light artillery. And a good way to distinguish light artillery from medium artillery, I know a lot of companies, they don't make really a 6 pounder gun and a 9 pounder gun specifically. And when you're playing a 6 millimeter, you can hardly tell. If you're playing like 28 millimeter, you can probably easily tell the difference between a light and a medium gun. But for our 6 millimeter, we'll base light artillery with just 2 guns to a base, whereas medium artillery will be 4 guns to a base. So that's how we easily tell on the board.
And then going to the last one is heavy artillery. The siege artillery is I've only used it once. That was going into Charleston. It wrecked shop. I loved it, and they're the big boys who sit in the back lobbing shells. Is how else can we implement that, and how do we base those very specifically?
Yeah, so basing heavy artillery, I would say you still base it 4 cannons to a base, but these guns need to be visually larger. So we buy most of our minis, at least for now, from Bacchus 6 millimeter, and we had to go to a 30 Years War section to get these long siege guns to work as our heavy artillery. So these are visually larger than the medium guns. So that's how we distinguish them. But heavy artillery, these are the large caliber guns. These are capable of inflicting devastating casualties at long range. They are powerful but built to reposition. So examples of these, we have 12 pounders, 18 pounders. Tabletop use, we're thinking the longest range in the game. I think our heavy guns have 60-inch range, a 60-inch range. They also have the highest damage, and they also have the slowest movement, right? So you kind of have pros and cons to this. Generally, when you have heavy guns on the board, they're normally not moving. And if you have them with your army, either your army is going to be really slow or you have to move the guns independently on the campaign map. Because if I surround a town but I don't have the heavy guns with me on campaign, it's going to take them forever to get to whatever siege position I'm at, unless you've pre-coordinated like moving them on ships or other ways like that. So you want to position heavy guns very carefully before battle because you are not going to be able to easily, redeploy these. Historically and in gaming, moving them often wastes their greatest advantage. If you're constantly worried about moving them, maybe you're not worried about firing or getting more accuracy down. So whenever you put them on the board, just keep in mind they're probably going to stay where they're at. These are really good at sieges. If you have heavy artillery in your army during a siege, that is going to speed up the rate at which you are reducing the enemy's defenses. I would also say heavy artillery breaks through enemy fortifications a lot easier than medium or light artillery. And taking canister shot from heavy artillery, dude, like the canister on it's wild. I think like if you roll a 6, it's 4 beads of damage. So instantly 80% casualties getting hit by heavy artillery. It's pretty devastating. Um, I would say these definitely need to be more rare. Um, I know in our current campaign, the British and Americans have both been talking about getting heavy artillery. I've been kind of slow to give it to them because it takes a lot of resources to make these guns and to transport them. So just keep that in mind. A little bit more rare. These are good for either coastal batteries facing out to sea or mainly for sieges. You're not really going to bring these to a normal battle, but if you do, they will rule the battlefield, guaranteed.
Yeah, in our current campaign, I know that I have some, but it was very specifically told they're not moving. They're here to do this one job. You can't move them. They're essentially super glued into the concrete. For my now, let's go to indirect. Okay, we have three types: rockets, mortars, and howitzers. How do we base those? How do we paint those? What do those look like?
Yeah, so these indirect artillery weapons, these are going to be a little bit more rare in comparison to your direct fire ones. The howitzers, we base those the same as medium artillery. 4 howitzers to a base. That's what makes a regular battery. Mortars, we put 2 to a base. These are wildly inaccurate anyway, so it doesn't really matter how many you have. It's not like a total war game where you spawn like 50 of them and one of them's going to hit. And rockets, we haven't done it in 6 mil. I've done it in 15 mil. And what I normally do is I lump rockets into 4 rocket batteries. So I put 4 rockets to a single base.
Okay. Then let's talk about rockets because that's one that we don't use because we don't normally war game European battles. But I know in Europe it was much more common than it ever was in America. Uh,
Mhm.
how do we implement those on the battlefield?
Yeah, so rockets were notorious for their inaccuracy, but they have tremendous psychological effect on enemy troops. Some of them will whistle, blow overhead, and at times when they do hit the ground, they have potentially devastating hits. Um, I would say make these a little bit more rare because, especially in the 1700s, they're not being widely used. By the Napoleonic Wars, they're somewhat coming into fashion, into use, but they're really going to fall away um, in the latter part of the century. So examples of these, we have something called the Congreve rocket, Mysorean rockets. Um, Tabletop use, most certainly unpredictable fire. Maybe you need to roll to because once you shoot these things, like they're not going down a barrel, right? You're not really aiming them. You're just pointing in a direction and hoping that the sheer amount of rockets hit something. So perhaps have the ability to hit your own troops. Maybe figure out a way how to do that. I would say you could roll the chance for a malfunction or deviation in the direction. But the big thing here is the morale penalty. Let's say you're assaulting an enemy fortification. Try to shoot those rockets over it. Make the enemy keep their head down. Make them scared and have bad morale effects. That way, whenever your troops come over the top with a bayonet, those guys might instantly surrender. Rockets should feel very chaotic. Their unpredictability is what makes them very memorable and fun. I know I played a Napoleonic game with rockets once, and I accidentally blew up one of my regimental commanders because he was too far forward and a rocket hit him right in the chest. So um, keep these in mind. I want to save these. You could also just use them as a signal weapons, but really morale effect is going to be their big hit.
Yeah, it sounds like they're basically just bottle rockets that are just launching off, and you have no clue where they're going.
Mm-hmm.
Um, let's talk about mortars. Is there's some heavy hitters. I've seen them turn the tide of a battle before. How does one implement mortars into the game? Is that a defensive weapon, offensive weapon, or does it matter? It's just a weapon.
I would say mortars. You're not really going to see these in just a typical like battle out in the open. Mortars are going to fire at very steep angles, and these are going to be primarily used against sieges or during sieges, and bombardments against fortifications. Um, you can put these on ships. So on a ship, they're known as like a bomb catch, right? We see that during the siege of Fort McHenry, right, in the War of 1812. So these are mainly siege mortars. You're not going to find these in just a regular pitched battle, like right. You're not going to see many of these like at Waterloo, for instance. But if you're besieged and you're within a fortification, mortars are fine as well. But the thing to remember is that these are extreme indirect fire weapons, so they're not going to have great accuracy. I would say better than rockets, but they're not going to be good at all. But when they do hit, they need to do very good damage, especially on exposed infantry. If you have an exploding shell, I think I had a regiment of 400 men marching up, and a mortar shell landed directly in the center of that regiment,
Hmm.
and all 10 companies took 1 beat of damage. So 10 companies instantly at 20% casualties. It was pretty bad, but you have to roll a 6 on that to make that happen. So very, very inaccurate weapon, but when it does hit, it needs to hit well. The most important thing to remember is that these, much like rockets, and probably more so than rockets, have limited mobility on the battlefield. I would say more so even than heavy artillery. I say if you want to move it on the battle mat, it can only move 1 inch max. Or in some cases, I know how Nathan runs his games. these are stationary things. They can only be moved during campaign mode because they're so heavy. These aren't on wheels. These are on like carriages on the ground normally. But these are excellent against formations. They shoot at a very high angle, so the troops hiding behind a beautiful breastwork doesn't matter. It ignores cover. In our game, these indirect fire weapons ignore cover that the enemy is taking. So just shoots right over and hits them. So you pretty much negate enemy fortifications, and these are excellent against dense infantry formations. Big thing to remember: these mortars are going to shine during siege games and campaigns where towns, forts, and redoubts are important objectives. So I really wish we had one at Charleston because that thing was fortified, two fortified lines. And I really wish we had mortars to shoot over it, but we just had to go in with a bayonet and took casualties due to that.
They had a mortar and it just did not hit, except for once, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's
Is it hit
pretty bad hit.
once? It did some damage. Now let's go to howitzers.
Yeah, you could think of howitzers like a smaller caliber mortar just put on a movable carriage now. So these are going to fire explosive shot in a higher arc than traditional cannons. So with your direct fire artillery, this comes right out. The howitzers can elevate, but not as much as a mortar. So don't give them a steeper or the same angle of a mortar. This is going to allow them to, much like the mortar, engage units behind hills, walls, and in some cases, buildings and breastworks. We can think about howitzers from the Napoleonic period, from the American Revolutionary War. These are effective against troops in cover. They have a moderate range. So really the only difference between a howitzer and mortar in our game is it has less of an arc to shoot. Um, it does have a higher probability to hit than a mortar, and it can also move, unlike a mortar. A mortar cannot move. So it's excellent for attacking defended positions. Um, just keep in mind, these are used to ignore cover, maybe explode above enemy troops to rain shrapnel down on them. There's some other shots like lime shot and carcass shot. We haven't really implemented that in the game. Maybe we could in the future, but that's really the only difference between the howitzer and the mortar is it can move. And I would generally say, as far as ranges, it depends. You know, you have high caliber howitzers that might be able to shoot further at a greater angle, but we just call howitzers howitzers for now in our game. Now, Civil War, where we're starting to get in more um, precise artillery, you know, each artillery piece is completely different from the other. We might include that, but for just black powder, a howitzer is a howitzer.
Is also for forts and everything, and I can't remember if we talked about this in our fortifications video. Is the forts themselves can have certain guns depending on the
Mm.
size of that fort. If it's just going to be a hastily built earthen fort, or you've thrown up, just a small little defensive, entrenchments, probably light cannons. But if it's been there for a while, maybe they do have a heavy cannon, a mortar, something like that. So that's some food for thought whenever you're doing these war games. Uh, is there any other artillery type out there that we've missed?
Without moving further in time to like the Civil War, I can't think of any. I would say, guys, in the comments, if there is a major artillery type that we have missed, please throw it down there. Give us some food for thought. Maybe we can include that in one of our war games coming up.
I completely agree. Look forward to reading those. But until then, thanks for stopping by.
That's it for today's episode. For battles, brushes, and everything in between, make sure you subscribe and join the community. Until next time, Generals, see you on the tabletop.